The 7 days of rage protests will be conducted across the country till the 25th.
That was the scene this past June in Nairobi, as thousands of Kenyans flooded the streets in protest.
After several failed attempts, thousands of protesters finally reached Parliament. They forced their way inside, ransacked the building and set part of it on fire.
The grave injustice they wanted fixed? The protesters were upset with how the government had decided to raise funds, which were needed in part to pay back loans. According to the Central Bank of Kenya, the International Monetary Fund, or IMF, and World Bank loan programs accounted for more than 40% of the country's external debt. Kenya's solution had been to raise taxes on everyday goods, so taxing everyday items like bread, a whopping 16%.
This seething anger stemmed from a government attempt to raise taxes on lots of things, from cars to sanitary pads, smartphones, and staples like sugar, vegetable oil, bread.
Young Kenyans are demonstrating for their rights. They're demonstrating with flags and banners. I can't even see anymore. They're being tear gassed.
Wanjira Wanjiru was among thousands of protesters, and at times, it got dangerous.
I was worried for all the lives we were losing. My mom called me and she was like, I know you're in there, retreat. I can see you guys are being shot, please retreat. And we were retreating like moving style, on our knees, on the grass, and hearing gunshots.
This is not the result the IMF had in mind when it initially set up a program in 2021 to offer debt relief and to encourage private sector investment. But the strings attached proved to be too onerous for many Kenyans, since they encouraged tough policy reforms, including ways to increase revenue. One suggestion involved privatizing certain Kenyan public goods, like electricity. This push and pull by big multilateral institutions, helping developing countries overcome debt, while also dealing with the very real-world impact of new taxes on a community. This is really at the heart of many of the issues being discussed this year at the IMF World Bank meetings, which we attended. When is assistance helpful? What's the best form of it? And what guarantees are needed? And what terms are too strict? You're listening to The Hidden Economics of Remarkable Women, a production of Foreign Policy. I'm Reena Ninan. We focused this season on many of the discussions that occurred at the fall meetings of the IMF World Bank, which took place in late October in Washington, D.C. Later on the show, we'll hear more about how the protests in Kenya were addressed by the IMF and World Bank. But before that, we wanted to know more about what's happening on the ground. Our guide for today's episode will be journalist Sharon Kiburi, who we spoke to from her office in Nairobi. Thank you so much for making the time.
Thank you so much.
We know with this proposed finance bill, IMF had pushed for this largely, but also there was a lot of Kenyan youth that were against this, particularly Gen Z. Why?
The burden of taxation was now centered towards consumer goods, which now affected most Kenyans. And that's when the Gen Z generation decided to go to protest, because then this was adversely affecting them directly in terms of how they access services, the living standards, and especially in terms of like electricity in Kenya that has gone really up. And this was a result of Kenya Power being privatized more and government subsidies being removed. There was proposed taxation in terms of mobile transactions, which is the biggest thing in Kenya, especially Kenya is the home of mobile banking, which runs a lot of the economy in Kenya, especially in simple transactions. And then also the bill proposed that people using internet like YouTubers, bloggers will be charged a very high tax rate. That was a problem for most young people because there's a very high rate of unemployment in Kenya, and that affects how the youths who are unemployed earn money. And most of them are in internet, earning money through blogging, through YouTubing and TikTok, which is also largely used in Kenya. So for them to be proposed a taxation that was affecting them on top of a consumer taxation that was really influencing them was a big problem.
You mentioned the high unemployment rates. I want to dig a little deeper into the financial crisis impacting everyday Kenyans. How is it impacting particularly women and girls?
Well, Like every other country, this is a very big problem, especially for women and girls, because women and girls still suffer the gap of low pay, especially in jobs, because most of them are the ones working in informal settlements. And despite the fact that women are the backbone of families, especially in African culture, sort of, most of them focus a lot on unpaid care work, and this is influencing them very differently, especially when a consumer tax is introduced where the goods they use every day in terms of food, oil, and all these other things that they need to survive makes life hard and difficult for them.
In 2004, Kenya was the first country to get rid of taxes on menstrual products. But the Spring Finance Bill added back a tax on items like tampons and sanitary napkins. Now that we know some of the details about the finance bill, let's find out more from Sharon Kiburi about the protesters, including Wanjira Wanjiru, who you heard from at the top of the show.
Wanjira Wanjiru is an activist and was very much involved in terms of protesting, from planning the protest to execution and to literally leading people into peaceful protest. She runs an organization that helps to speak out for people's injustice.
We were already overtaxed. And the worst thing about that situation is we were not getting any services for our money. The doctors were on strike, the teachers were on strike, school-going children had been denied food. It was just a very bad situation.
She's from Mathare. Mathare is one of Kenya's informal settlements around Nairobi. Informal settlements typically do struggle economically.
You find that people who are able to afford 3 meals a day now are going only on 2. You find that school-going children who are depending on the food that is offered at schools, which has now been taken away, now become even more hungrier. You find that life becomes more difficult than it already was. This is why so many people from Mathare came to reject the finance bill.
If you cannot afford to buy things to survive, then you will feel like the government is failing.
We have to pay almost 50% of our hard-earned money to debt, which we cannot even tell what it does for us. No government projects are running. No social development things are going on. Just where is this money going to? That's problematic.
I think for her, she said the motivation also was that she wants to fight for Africa, for Kenya.
That's a beautiful answer. What do they hope the future will look like?
I think for her, the conversation went from she wants to see a fair economy where most people can have the same level of achievement, level of affording things, and also just literally changing her environment. Because the moment that the poorest of the people in a society cannot afford education, cannot afford food, it's a big problem.
And we are asking for simple things. We are asking for food. We are asking for shelter. We are asking for healthcare. We are asking for education. We're not asking for mega projects. We are asking for basic human needs, which have not been met with all these billions that our country has.
And for her biggest dream was that we need to have a fair economy. We need to have people in parliament that represent us fairly.
It was an amazing time to be alive. I'm so glad I took part in the protest. I'm so glad I stormed parliament.
Protesters have breached the parliament building and smoke has been billowing from its windows.
They stormed the parliament. Tell me a little bit more about what happened with that.
Parliament was stormed because there was a voting earlier that the voting, which was of course being streamed live, and hence most Gen Zs felt that the MPs, the members of parliament, were not representing their interests and they were not listening to their voices.
Storming parliament, it felt like we are here to represent ourselves because parliamentarians have failed to represent us.
The idea was to storm parliament and express their dislike for whatever was going on because they were not supporting this bill. This bill was not a representation of what the Kenyan people wanted, and they wanted their voices to be heard. So unfortunately, when they stormed parliament, there was a bit of chaos, and unfortunately, we also lost lives, and they never meant it for it to be violent.
5 people are reported dead, Dozens injured.
I was worried for all the lives we were losing. My mom called me and she was like, I know you're in there, retreat. I can see you guys are being shot, please retreat. And we were retreating like moving style on our knees on the grass and hearing gunshots, and it was worth the fight.
Kenya's protest this summer against the finance bill, did it work?
It did to some extent. And we did see that the president called for this bill to be revised. And hence, some of these changes and actually the bill being rejected is as a result of the Gen Z protests.
Listening keenly to the people of Kenya that they want nothing to do with this Finance Bill 2024, I concede, and therefore I will not sign.
Based on your experience, what do you think needs to be done to solve this situation? And what do you think needs to change, both within larger institutions like the IMF as well as the Kenyan government?
We could blame the government. The Kenyan government has a very high appetite for expenditures. And debt is not necessarily such a bad thing. But then if the money that comes in, both from debt, loans, is not used in the right way, then when we will find ourselves in this challenging problem of the economy. So the problem is that the money is not used for the right things. And a lot of it is lost in terms of, I think our former president mentioned that we lose almost, 2 billion, some money in terms of corruption every day.
President Uhuru Kenyatta said during radio interviews that people in his government are stealing 2 billion shillings daily. 2 billion. That's how many zeros?
So a lot of money is lost in misappropriation. So we have a problem with political goodwill, which is the reason why most of the money we have does not end up going to services, to development. I feel that the debt problem can be addressed if we have good political goodwill. We have justice systems that really work and keep people accountable. And then the government needs to be more proactive in terms of ensuring that our finances are well utilized. And then I think in terms of the IMF and the World Banks and the Chinas of today, they should be at least more flexible in terms of the loans they give us and in terms of how we repay them. Because some of the austerity measures that they purport in terms of the reforms or maybe the terms of how we pay the loans affects us a lot.
Sharon, thank you so much for your incredible reporting and for staying on this, and I want to thank you for your time.
Thank you so much. It was lovely to meet you.
A lot has happened since June. So what's the current state of Kenya's debt, including the IMF program? More on that after the break. Welcome back to The Hidden Economics of Remarkable Women, a production of Foreign Policy. I'm Reena Ninan. Before the break, we spoke with Nairobi-based reporter Sharon Kiburi about the protests this summer against a Kenyan finance bill with steep tax hikes. These demonstrations made an impact. Kenyan President William Ruto ultimately decided to withdraw the bill. But the government still has debts to pay off, including many to the IMF.
It was very clear that we do have a debt problem, but the root cause of that problem is bad governance, it's corruption.
This is Diana Gichengo, Executive Director of the Institute for Social Accountability in Kenya. She spoke on a panel organized by Transparency International U.S. and moderated by the Trust Accountability and Inclusion TAI Collaborative on the sidelines of the IMF World Bank meetings. Unless you deal with corruption, Gichengo doesn't think fiscal measures are going to make much of a difference. She and members of her coalition have been in touch with the current IMF program in Kenya since it started in 2021, and they warned them about the corruption issue, among other things.
Our last letter to the IMF last year, we informed them, if you do not listen, the process that you're taking the Kenyan government and the Kenyan people through of just raising more and more revenue while thinning access to essential services, particularly to health, to education, to water, was to take us on a certain path.
It was this tension that she believes was at the heart of the June protests.
2024, the government came with more bullishness, bravado, trying to make sure they meet all the IMF requirements and their own requirements, and the Kenyan people just had had enough. They understood that the problem is a governance problem, and trust had been lost completely. Trust with our current government and trust with the IMF and all their processes.
She says there's been more engagement from the IMF since the June protests.
The IMF has come back and is speaking to civil society. But before that, the 6th and the 7th review were done without any civil society or citizenly participation.
Gichengo notes that recently the Kenya Finance Ministry requested a government diagnostic from the IMF. This is actually an assessment about corruption and government vulnerabilities. It can take between 8 months and a year to complete. But she voiced concern about the institution's capacity to change things.
Unless the government genuinely moves away from just this craving and appetite they have for money to use as they deem fit and not necessarily for citizens' priorities, then they will have no capacity because the root cause is corruption.
Domestically, she hasn't seen much progress on this front.
There was a law that was supposed to curb conflict of interest and ensure beneficial ownership, and was supposed to ensure particularly people who hold public office are not able to get contract. It was amended to protect that particular political class. We've seen proposals for all crimes related to procurement that anybody who is an employee of government should not be found culpable. Who else commits these crimes? So I think this has we've regressed. Overall, access to public services has declined. The cost of post-basic education has increased 4 times. 4 times in a country where poverty has increased during this particular period. Cost of healthcare, we are implementing a very capitalist model. Now we are paying for public healthcare insurance premiums that are higher than any private insurance, yet our public hospitals are completely, they are headed for their deathbed. I don't think if we continue like this, we'll have no public healthcare. That's the lived reality of what the current IMF program has done to the life and livelihoods of Kenyans.
And finally, Gichengo noted an inherent problem in how the IMF is constructed.
One of the things, and which is linked to why the Kenyan program was bound to fail, is the fact that the IMF, in its formation, in its architecture, in its thinking, in its philosophy, the creditor, their client, is government. But if we are to apply the principle of fiscal constitutionalism, all money that is given to as sovereign debt will be paid as tax. And there should be no tax without representation. Therefore, there should be no debt without representation, especially because debt has even deeper ramification. So shareholders within IMF, within the bank, the World Bank as well, know they can no longer ignore the voices of millions of Kenyans.
That was Diana Gichengo, Executive Director of the Institute for Social Accountability in Kenya. Thanks to the Trust Accountability and Inclusion Collaborative, which sent us this recording. We reached out to both the IMF program in Kenya as well as the Kenya Finance Ministry for an interview or comment. We didn't receive a response by the time of this broadcast. According to an IMF fact sheet about Kenya, the ratio of public debt service to revenue has increased from about 35% to 60% of revenue over the last decade. It says, quote, Kenya needs to mobilize more revenues to meet the country's needs, end quote. New tax bills were introduced in late October. Those bills are not including as many tax hikes as the summer and proposing to raise around half the amount of money as the June finance bill. They are largely focused on taxing internet and tourism services. But there are still concerns about some of the items still left in, especially as it pertains to women and girls, taxes on diapers, and sanitary products are still being considered. So often we end each of these episodes with some type of high note or cause for optimism. But I have to admit there's a lot more to worry about here than to be hopeful for. If there's anything, though, that I could take away from my time in D.C., it's that these issues are not invisible. That there are a lot of very smart and dedicated leaders who want to move Kenya and other developing countries to a more sustainable economic future. Next week on the show, we meet two of those smart leaders who have been in the trenches to effect change, and they discuss a program developed by the World Bank that's made a big difference. It's called the International Development Association, or IDA, and its main purpose is to find a way to free developing countries from the yoke of debt.
IDA is probably one of the most important external sources of financing.
This concessional fund is going to be critical.
The future of IDA, next week on Hero. And that does it for today's show. The Hidden Economics of Remarkable Women is a production of Foreign Policy. This season, we're supported by the Gates Foundation, Northwestern University's Roberta Buffett Institute for Global Affairs, and the Atlantic Council. The Hidden Economics of Remarkable Women is hosted by me, Reena Ninan. Laura Rossbrow-Tellem is our senior producer. Rob Sachs, our managing director. Claudia Tatey provided production assistance. And Sharon Kiburi contributed reporting for this episode. Thanks so much, and we'll be back in your feed next week.